Thank you so much for having us here in Heidelberg. We're still kind of pinching ourselves that we've come all the way to talk to you about porridge, but here we are. I'll hand over to James to introduce himself.
Yeah, so I'm James Leach. Lovely to meet you all. I think the best way we can, I'm sure we'll get to know each other quite well over the next 45 minutes, but the best way I think we can get to know each other immediately, considering the circumstances, is for me to share my favourite porridge with you, and that is a traditional Scottish porridge, the recipe of which we'll get into later, but that is topped with brown sugar, butter and cream, which is a kind of like heart attack waiting to happen. So I'm sure by the time I'm 50 I'll be gone, but do you know what, that's fine, it's quite delicious. Adam?
Yeah, I think mine is a little bit less simple than James's. It channels my passion for fungi, and it's an oyster mushroom, hazelnut, plum and mint yogurt porridge. So yeah, leading swiftly on to our talk, we're going to be talking to you today about the tall tale of how we went from talking about porridge in James's bedroom on a dull evening in Birmingham to how we ended up on national television teaching Britons how to cook the world's best porridge. Along the road, we'll touch on the history of Mesopotamia, the musings of Roman philosophers, and our journey to becoming porridge-making champions of the world. So we got into porridge when we started an Instagram page called forage_UK, and that will be the first of many plugs. And this Instagram page was aiming to be a platform to kind of stage our OT adventures.
Yeah, exactly. And I think across all of the kind of odd meandering roads of our kind of porridge pursuits, this is the peak of it, and we certainly did not expect to be giving this talk at the University of Heidelberg. And just to give you a kind of a brief story of how we ended up doing this. So Julia Dolderer, who I'm sure you'll know, one of your teachers, we met in Berlin when we were on holiday in Berlin, because we were meeting up with some mutual friends who we'd met at the porridge competition, and sort of nursing a pretty messy hangover from a kind of Berlin club the night before. We thought we'd sort of warm ourselves with some porridge, and met up with our friends from the competition. And Julia was a mutual friend, and a couple of months later, after being in contact, she emailed us and asked if we'd like to give this talk, and we obviously very quickly said absolutely. So just thank you all for coming, and we hope you enjoy, and if you hate it, blame Julia, she invited us. So.
Okay, enough about us though. We want to know how porridge literate our audience is. So we have a few questions. First of all, please raise your hand if you know what porridge is.
Decent.
Keep your hand raised if you've ever eaten porridge in your life. Now keep it raised if you've eaten porridge in the last week. And how about the last day? Okay, we like you.
2 winners.
Yeah, so yeah, I think that demonstrates we've got quite a diversity of porridge literacy in our audience, but that's fine. We'll try and cater to all audiences. So yeah, the tale that we're going to tell today will be channeled through 3 key characters: the porridge, the oats, and the people. The story will take place on 2 scales, and will show how these 3 characters have interacted over thousands of years and across the globe, while entwining this tale of our own story. James will be playing the role of the porridge, I will be playing the role of the oats, and you will be playing the role of the people.
Perfect. And I think what we want to achieve by the end of this is that we hope you've got just a little bit of the passion for porridge that we clearly are humming with. We want you to be able to pass down the tale of oats, porridge and people to posterity, and that you'll all quit your current studies and take up porridge studies instead, and that of course you'll be following forage_UK on Instagram by the end of this, second of many plugs. And before we get into the detail of the story we're going to be spinning, we need to open the door to let in the OT air. We want to ground the narrative in the porridge of the present, the porridge that so many of us know and love, and understand its history, so that we know how the past tells us that porridge is the food of the future.
Oats, water, and salt. These three essential ingredients of a traditional Scottish porridge are one of the foundational foods of Scottish culture. As we'll learn later, the essential framework of this recipe of grain, water, and salt goes back over 5,000 years and has spanned dozens of cultures. This salty simplicity can sometimes turn up a few noses, but trust me, it's beautiful. The water and the salt act as the pedestal, allowing the oats to sing.
And Adam and I take quite a similar tack with our recipes for traditional porridge. We use 1 cup of unrolled steel cut porridge oats. So usually when you get porridge in the supermarkets, it's kind of it's kind of flat. This is a kind of thick grain. It's less industrialized, less processed, and that's with the 1 cup of that. 3 cups of water, preferably straight from the Scottish Highlands, but do with what you can. And then 3 teaspoons of salt, so way more salt than you'd expect. We should also mention the tools that we kind of, or the spurtle, which we can kind of show here, this kind of thick wooden device. That is a traditional Scottish porridge stirring implement that you kind of stir the porridge pot with.
Just to interject, this exact spurtle is the one that won the World Championships, passed down from my grandmother.
Exactly, it's kind of blessed.
Yeah.
And these are the spurtles you have to stir with at the porridge making championships.
So the traditional Scottish porridge recipe, we feel, is a canvas for so much creativity, sweet, salty, and everything in between. It's the basis for every single forage porridge that we make. We'll talk to you more about forage later, but for now, I'll hand over to James, who's almost ready to begin our epic tale.
Almost ready. And just before we get into the tale of porridge, the tale of oats, this is quite an ambitious task that we've tried to set ourselves to give. It's a long history of porridge and oats. So what I was worried about is I don't want you to get bored along the way. And so I'm going to give you a little safe word, or rather a safe action to use if you find yourself getting bored. And to get to that safe word, we need to bypass a classic bit of Scottish folklore around porridge making. So we mentioned the spurtles a second ago, but there's a folklore in Scottish porridge making that if you stir the porridge counterclockwise instead of clockwise with your spurtle, you stir the devil into the porridge and thereby curse it. So if you find yourself ever getting bored, I want you to start stirring counterclockwise. And if you start doing that, I'm not sure what we'll do, but we'll find something. We'll hurry up or something. But without further ado, let's get into the kind of history of porridge. Do you mind doing the slides for me? Because I'm so left-handed that I can't do two things at once. Okay, so the kind of title of this section is porridge, the tradition of transformation. So in spite of the reputation that porridge seems to have garnered through a kind of vicious propaganda campaign that markets porridge as this kind of tasteless gruel of forgettable childhoods. I don't know if you've ever seen or consumed Oliver Twist, the kind of Dickens play, but you have the image of gruel there. It's kind of this kind of tasteless slop. But in spite of that, porridge actually has royal and ancient origins. Can you go to the next slide, please? So a form of porridge was actually consumed in ancient Egypt. So Aylward Blackman, who is a famous early 20th century Egyptologist, examines the mystery of a hieroglyph, which he traces to the Nubian and modern Egyptian Mifrika. And you can see that on the screen there. So that is just like a spurtle, a traditional ancient Egyptian an ancient Egyptian spurtle, basically, which was used to stir a kind of lentil-based porridge. And similarly, in a book called Cooking in Ancient Civilizations by an academic called Kathy Kaufman, she speaks about sasku, which is a Mesopotamian porridge, which is made out of dates and barley. And that actually offers up a slightly mad story about the power that porridge can have to bring down a king. So obviously in Mesopotamia, porridge was supposedly a dish for royalty, and when the king Eremitty was enacting a kind of ritual whereby he'd asked his gardener Enlil-Bani to take his throne as a substitute, as a temporary substitute, when the true king was dining. So his gardener took on the throne, put on his crown, and as Eremitty was dining on his hot porridge, as he was taking little sips, he choked and died. And the gardener who was on the throne sort of wasn't quite sure what to do, managed to stay put and assume sovereignty. So clearly porridge can sort of intervene in monarchical succession, which seems quite strange. If you can change slides, please. So just further on the kind of ancient origins of porridge. We know that the oat porridge we know and love, has a complex, long, ancient history. And this history can't be limited to a single grain. It can't be limited, the history of porridge, to oats. So whether that's the lentils in ancient Egypt or the barley and dates of Mesopotamia. Recent evidence has actually found in the famous science journal Nature that oats aren't even the origin of traditional Scottish porridge. And that actually in the Neolithic period, around 5,500 years ago, Scots were actually making a type of wheat porridge, and that was found through traces of cereal biomarkers in Neolithic pottery that had been dredged up in rivers and lakes. So what we now imagine as the traditional Scottish porridge, oats, salt, water, even that is a relatively modern kind of culinary articulation. So what I want to see is perhaps porridge, when it arrives in our bowls, maybe it's this kind of royal ancient inheritance of where we have been. If you can go on to the next slide. So that's where we, I think, get into the crux of what I'm trying to sort of communicate here. What we can see is that the character of porridge changes its face over the course of history. We can see this in a kind of encounter between necessity and invention that defines porridge. Necessity in the sense that the rich variety of porridges that have been produced by cultures globally across time have been a response to what is kind of climatically available. People obviously make porridge out of grains that are near to hand. If you're in the Neolithic, if you're a Neolithic Scot, it's going to be wheat. So it's made of what's near to you. But then there's invention in the sense that porridge always seems to be a process of local micro transformations, little constant changes that get tattooed or inscribed onto the inheritance of a traditional dish. Obviously on a grand scale, you see that in Scotland, the move from wheat to oats, but we also see that in loads of other places. And we can see this, for example, in Hausa cocoa, which is a type of porridge originating in northern Ghana, made out of fermented millet or sorghum, and you can see that on the screen there. And it's also kind of served with with masa, which is a kind of fried millet or corn paste, which I believe is kind of served alongside there on the kind of, oh yeah, much more technological use. I'm sort of waving. And in that article, which was a kind of article in conjunction between Wageningen University and the Crops Research Institute in Kumasi in Ghana, they found that, well, in the making of Hausa cocoa and this millet grain porridge, a lot of the ingredients kind of remain the same, that in it becoming a dish of national identity and it becoming a Ghanaian dish, it's a constant process of transformation, whether that's through kind of regional and ethnic specializations. So that might be mediated through preparation methods and the regional availability of things like firewood. You also have street vendors kind of adding corn dough into the mix as they're cooking. So in the making of porridge, in all of its global pluralities, there are these micro-transformations that make flexible the long-honed traditions of national porridges. And I think you also look at the kind of mad contingency. This is a dish that's been going on for so many thousands of years that the historical archive is obviously so cracked open. So in that Nature article I mentioned, where there'd been Neolithic pottery found in Scotland, it's difficult to tell whether that porridge was made with or without milk. And in those kind of little gaps where you can't quite tell what happened, I think you can see opening the door a sense that porridge is this experimental dish that is created locally. And I think you can really analogize all of porridge, the whole history in the cooking of a single bowl of porridge. You know, as you're throwing it into the pan, you stir it and it transforms, and it's not what you began with. And if we can change slides. So I should have probably started this with the question of what porridge is. So etymologically, the word emerges in the 16th century from the Middle English word pottage, derived from the Old French word of the same name. So pottage literally means that which is put in a pot. So there is this sense of porridge originating from a kind of a first emptiness, a first absence, a space to be filled with creativity and transformation and tradition. Next slide, please. So I'm going to, just before concluding my kind of section, I'm going to talk about my very first porridge and give you my own personal history. And just as a kind of jump scare, maybe this is an AI-generated image of Marcel Proust eating a bowl of porridge, because I'm going to go by way of a Proust quote to explain my history of porridge. So the first time I tried porridge, I was 4 years old, I think. I remember being sat on my kitchen floor with a bowl of plain kind of rolled oats with milk and sugar on the top. I don't know if you've had that before, but the sugar forms a thin kind of effervescent crust. And I was kind of thinking about that kind of first taste of porridge and maybe what it represented. And I was reading this quote from Marcel Proust's famous novel In Search of Lost Time. Really famous scene. I don't know if people have come across it before, where the main character dunks a madeleine in tea, and that gives him this this sense of deja vu that he can't, a memory he can't quite locate. And if you think a kind of a discourse on French modernist literature is a bit too pretentious for porridge, you can start stirring the devil into the porridge immediately. But I'm just going to read the quote, and then hopefully it will be useful. So I place in position before my mind's eye the still recent taste of that first mouthful, and I feel something start within me, something that leaves its resting place and attempts to rise, something that has been embedded like an anchor at a great depth. I do not know yet what it is, but I can feel it mounting slowly. I can hear the resistance. I can hear the echo of great spaces traversed. So in my porridge-based reading of this Proust segment, I'm going to mangle a bit of what he's trying to say. Obviously, in the scene, the madeleine isn't, the madeleine itself isn't that important. It's more of a muse on memory, its construction, and its relation to sensation. But considering maybe porridge's ancientness, how long it's fed so many people from across the globe, and considering the kind of language Proust is referring to, this kind of anchor embedded at great depth, I think we can imagine the taste we put in our bodies, the foods we consume, as the way our kind of bodies encounter history, that taste marks our precise situatedness within a given past. It's the way we as people quite literally swallow history. It's the way the present is submerged in the past, and maybe that's kind of what I did with that first bite of porridge. So I was kind of talking about, in conclusion, I was talking about porridge as transformation and as tradition. And I can definitely say that my porridge traditions have transformed completely over time. I mentioned Hausa cocoa earlier, which is a kind of millet-based Ghanaian porridge. And I remember trying to make that a few years ago, and I'd sort of got a bag of like millet flour, and I'd boiled it in water, and I topped it with raw onion, mayonnaise, and chili sauce. And just like to issue a formal apology to the people of Ghana, that we really was not pleasant. And I've definitely changed my attitude to porridge over time. When Adam and I kind of started Forage in 2019, it was a kind of fun fact about yourself we kind of give to our friends, tell to people at parties. But by now it's become a kind of obsession. I mean, we're on stage talking about it in the University of Heidelberg. It's a bit weird. But when we were training for the Golden Spurtle last year, we'd have these industrial-sized bags of oats delivered to our door, and we'd spend hours talking about the exact consistency of medium cut versus pinhead oats. And I can sort of genuinely talk about porridge all day. And on that note, I'll begin to sort of transition to Adam's section of the talk. So now that we've kind of established the meandering, multiplicitous, multinational story of porridge, I'll hand you over to Adam, who'll be telling the equally tall tale of the oat. And obviously we know now that porridge is this character of transformation, and that it can't be rooted historically to any single grain. But now, especially in Western countries, oats have defined themselves as the kind of grain par excellence of porridge, and it's lodged irrevocably into its kind of grand history. So, you know, telling the tale of the oat, I think, is more than a necessity. So without further ado, away you go.
Thank you very much, James. Yeah, so as James mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on oats because of their kind of integral part in modern porridge. So yeah, they've become known as kind of the foundational grain of porridge, but this is a relatively recent phenomenon. Unlike James, I am going to start at the beginning and talk to you about what oats are, very, very briefly. So they're a food and fodder grain eaten by people and livestock around the world with the Latin name Avena sativa, and that's all you're going to get. After this, I'm going to dive straight into the origin story of the oat, chapter 1 of which is entitled The Freaks of the Field. So the first page of the origin story of the oat could be opened at many points, but our story begins in the field of another set of crops. Those crops are wheat and barley. This was at a point before the people had begun eating oats, but after they had started eating porridge already with wheat and barley grains, as James mentioned earlier. Wheat and barley were both domesticated around 10,000 years ago, around the Fertile Crescent in an area today known as Turkey. At this point, oats had not yet been domesticated, so the wild oats were living in parallel with the people, and the handshake between the two had not yet occurred. When oats first met people, it was a tale of conflict. The wild ancestors of the modern oat were an agricultural weed. They snuck, uninvited, into fields that had been crafted by the people to grow wheat and barley. They were unwanted and misunderstood, seen as pests competing with the much more useful wheat and barley crops, but they stuck around. People tried and failed to eradicate them, and eventually they had to accept them as part of the wheat and barley cultivation process. See, pictured here, real evidence of a stealthy oat evading capture by the people. Next slide, please.
Sorry.
So the relationship was clearly built. Actually, sorry, previous slide. Yeah, so I forgot to mention, once the age of the Romans had finally rolled in, oats had already built a reputation as a disease of productive crops like wheat and barley. Pliny the Elder, an ancient Roman figure who was the author of the first known encyclopedia, championed the belief that wheat and barley would degenerate into oats when they're infected with a harmful disease. So we can see that the relationship between oats and people was clearly built on rocky foundations. The oats were dwelling in the shadows of sickness and people were trying to push them away. Next slide now, please. Okay, notes are out of order a little bit. Okay, so chapter 2 is entitled Enter Oats. Having held their position as squatters in the wheat fields, oats just had to wait in the wings for their moment. As people, along with their wheat and barley crops, travelled further into Central Europe, oats travelled with them, finding themselves in a much colder and wetter environment, which was an environment they were much better adapted to. When wheat and barley crops failed, the oats thrived. People began to select them for cultivation, both for direct consumption and as an animal feed. So over long periods of time and wide distances, people began to cultivate oats all across Europe. The oats and the people finally shook hands, put their rocky past behind each other, and answered each other's needs. Next slide, please. So, swiftly moving on to chapter 3 of the story, domestication in both directions. So both oats and people at this point were already acquainted, but now we start to see how they intermingle and influence each other. At this point, too, we're also starting to tease out some of the parallels in the tale of oats and porridge. Just like in the story of porridge, so beautifully spun by James earlier, the interplay between the needs of the people and the oats led to dynamism and micro-transformation. Timothy Walker, in A Very Short Introduction to Plants, explains that domestication can be generally defined as the gradual physical and genetic alteration of plants to improve them for use by people. So we can see here how oats and people are starting to influence each other. As oats became more widely cultivated, the people would naturally select those plants and populations that were better suited for their needs for further cultivation. Over time, this would result in certain preferred traits, such as taste or increased grain size, becoming more prominent in oat populations. These groups of traits are known as domestication syndromes. Through this process of microtransformation, human and oat, just like human and porridge, became tightly interlaced, each reliant on the other. From the oats' perspective, they had succeeded in securing their survival by giving the people exactly what they needed. They had achieved dominion over the kingdom of the people. Pictured on the right, we have the oat king, gazing with reverence over the success of his fellow oats. So, by around 4,000 years ago, oats had fully transitioned from pesky weed to essential domesticated crop. But as we heard earlier, wheat and barley had been domesticated 10,000 years ago, so it took 6,000 years after this first domestication event for oats to finally enter the story. But while some people certainly revered oats, their murky past continued to haunt them through to more modern times, with a famous quote from Samuel Johnson summing this up. When writing a dictionary definition in 1773, Dr. Johnson described oats as a grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people. Understandably, this has been taken as a slight against the Scots, but it also highlights the discrimination faced by this wonderful grain, even thousands of years after sneaking around in the shadows of the wheat field. Next slide, please. So, what have we learned? I'm just going to talk you through a kind of character analysis and try and summarize some of the things that we've learned so far. First of all, oats are sneaky, when they need to be at least. Before they were cultivated by the people, the ancestors of wild oats were weeds in wheat and barley fields. Secondly, oats are resilient. The wild ancestors of oats resisted prosecution by the people and were resilient enough to thrive in the new environments of Europe. And finally, oats are patient. They were secondary domesticates, domesticated after the likes of wheat and barley by around 6,000 years. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit, as James did, about my own story, which, as in the story of agriculture, oats came into my life very late. I'm ashamed to say that my first encounter with oats was quite opposite to James's philosophical revelations, and it was actually with an instant oat powder, which I won't name and shame. These instant oats, when compared with the unprocessed whole oats, are like the chihuahua when compared with the wolf. The undeniable majesty has been deformed into a tiny, whimpering, shivering creature peeking out from the top of its Gucci-tailored gilet. Sorry to disrespect the chihuahuas, they're just living their life. So if you could actually go back to the last slide. I just wanted to mention this picture in the top left is actually around the time that me and James first discovered oats properly, and not the instant oat powder that has haunted me for so many years. It actually all started with a late night conversation in James's living room in the summer of 2019. We were talking about how much we loved oats and how we felt that they were so underappreciated and they had so much potential to be a canvas for so many different flavors. And we kind of had this crazy idea that we wanted to start an oat cafe called Forage. And then we quickly realised we had no time and no money. So we decided instead to begin our oat journey by starting an Instagram page, forage_UK. That's another plug. Third plug, I think. Yeah,
we're doing okay, yeah.
So that kind of allowed us to start expressing ourselves and start trying out different recipes like the mango lassi porridge that was mentioned earlier. And we realised how much oats had to offer beyond our wildest dreams, I think. And it kind of started us on this crazy journey that is capitulated today. And we're still, as I said, pinching each other, I think. So yeah, oats had kind of been waiting in their wings, but they took their moment to impose themselves on our lives. Oats are inevitable and we are simply their vessels. Okay, next slide, please. So, moving swiftly on from my own personal tale, we want to now talk about the point where oats and porridge meet, because as we all know, that is the porridge that we know at the moment. So, both porridge and oats rose in isolation with one another, sliding into the fabric of human culture and refusing with an admirable resilience to leave. The sneaky oats were biding their time once again. Once wheat and barley porridge had become established as an essential feature of human culture, in came the oats to jump on their shoulders and make their way into the limelight. But so, as we roam into the realms of present and future, we ask the question, once oats meet porridge, what happens next? And to attempt to answer, we're going to take you to the seemingly sleepy town of Carbridge, to the World Porridge Making Championships.
Yes, I think if we're going to talk about the relevance of porridge now, what better place to start than the Golden Spurtle World Porridge Making Championships, which started 31 years ago in the town called Carbridge in the Highlands of Scotland, and you'll be sort of forgiven if you've never heard of Carbridge. But if you ever get the chance to go there, as you can see, it's quite beautiful.
The bridge of Carbridge.
Yeah, aforementioned bridge.
And this is the Golden Spurtle, if you haven't worked that out already. Yeah.
With bridge behind it. So it's got everything in that one picture, really. And we're actually standing there, just top right. We're standing in front of the town hall that the Golden Spurtle Championships take place in. So as I say, it was started 31 years ago, and genuinely people from across the globe come and participate in this competition. Last year there were people from Germany, from Australia, from Zimbabwe. Truly a kind of multinational celebration of porridge as a tradition. So the rules for participating in the Golden Spurtle are really simple. There are two fields of competition you can enter. The first one is the traditional porridge making, which is using the kind of recipe we've talked about a couple of times now. So just unrolled oats, salt and water. And that porridge is tested on its colour, its taste and texture. And then you get the specialty porridge, and that's where you can kind of get weird, you can get funky, you can get experimental, and adorn your porridge with a plethora of toppings. And now, if we want to talk about maybe our story at the Golden Spurtle. So kind of a few years after we'd started, in 2019, we'd started having this kind of ravenous excitement for porridge. We discovered, I think it was maybe like May, June 2023 last year, we saw a Guardian article about this porridge making championships, and we'd sort of like laughed it off. Oh, sounds silly, sounds fun. And then suddenly we had that kind of Hollywood stare across the room. Genuinely will always stay with me, where we're like, this could be us. We could be the porridge making champions. So then, well, basically we applied.
Yeah, and I think just like oats, we were underestimated. Two young English men who were travelling up to the home of porridge, or the home of modern porridge, which is Scotland. I think we went in having despite what James has just said, we didn't really have an expectation of actually winning. We were just going, and we knew how much we loved porridge, so we thought, what better place to find like-minded individuals than the porridge championships? But yeah, we really did not expect to win. Yeah.
Well, once we'd entered, we practiced like a hell of a lot. and I used, so in my kind of specialty recipe, I used fennel, and I don't know if you've, like, I hadn't seen fennel before, but it, like, if you've never seen it, it's like an onion with hair. It's like, it's strange, and it's also quite expensive. So I'd like practically like bankrupted myself by the time I'd like practiced enough with my specialty recipe.
Yeah, our bank accounts really did take a hit, actually.
It really did. And yeah, also because we were cooking so much, we were practically kind of like force feeding our friends, sort of shoveling as much sort of fennel as they could fit.
One of our friends is actually in the audience, so sorry, Holly.
Big up, yeah. So I feel like I've already apologised to the people of Ghana, so maybe I must apologise also to our sort of friends around that time, because also we were talking about it a hell of a lot. It became our kind of USP. Anytime we were at a party, we considered it a new opportunity to be like, by the way, have we said we're going to the World Porridge Making Championships?
I mean, this is dreamland for us right now.
This is genuinely dreamland, yeah. Yeah, you're really feeding our kind of our oat-based narcissism here. But you know what? I'm not that sorry for talking and training so much about the porridge, because all of that talking and training did eventually bring us to the final of the championships.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, that was a huge shock to both of us. We had competed in the heat, so that's the way it's set up. There are 6 heats on the day, and then there's a grand final where the 6 best cook against each other for the title. And I think when they both announced our names, it was another Hollywood moment, another kind of unforgettable shock, and I think chaos ensued. Kind of, neither of us really knew where we were walking into walls, knocking porridge pots off tables.
Pandemonium.
Absolute pandemonium. And yeah, we went to try and collect our ingredients up so we could go and compete in the final cook-off. Only a 5-minute changeover, so it was pretty stressful. And it did lead to some big errors. So neither of us remembered to bring a ladle for serving our porridge. So we had to share 1 teaspoon that we had for weighing out the salt into our porridge. So that took a very long time. There was lots of mini scoops into the bowl. It's
also a plastic spoon, so we did melt the spoon through that kind of...
Maybe yet to be determined if that is the secret to the best porridge.
Yeah, bit of plastic, yeah.
And yeah, so another crazy chaos was in the final. I managed to double my salt amounts by accident. And thankfully, James had also got to the final and was in front of me. So I stole his oats, with his consent, of course, and doubled up my ratios. And then after all of this chaos, they announced that I'd won. I think we've got a nice demonstration of James's face immediately after the announcement.
I can't underestimate how dramatic it felt in that moment. I my heart beating, sweating, all familiar feelings.
Yeah, it was pretty mad. And then from that point onwards, the chaos kind of continued. We, as was mentioned earlier, we were on the radio, we were on television, on a daytime television show, which did get cancelled about 3 days after we appeared on it, but we're hoping that wasn't the reason.
Yeah.
Beyond that, we then ended up on Oatly, the oat milk company. We ended up on their TikTok page, and we were the kind of butt of one of their jokes. And I think it ended up with something like 15 million views. And we had random people who'd met once or twice sending us messages being like, OMG, I just saw you on TikTok.
Somebody I'd been to school with messaged me who I hadn't seen in 11 years. I was like, you're in my TikTok algorithm. Yeah,
it was very strange. Very strange indeed. But yeah, that was our crazy story last October, and we're hoping that it will continue once again when we compete again next October. But before then, we would like to continue the tale that we were telling before and move on to what we feel is the future of porridge. So as James mentioned earlier, and as evidenced by the focus of the World Porridge Making Championships, oats and porridge are wrapped around each other in a way that makes them economically inseparable in the Western world. Oat porridge has stirred its spurtle into global markets and into global palates. So pictured on the screen here we have European imports of oats to Germany alone in 2022, totaling 163 million US dollars. So the oats in your morning bowl, for those of you that did eat oats this morning, have probably covered vast distances, most likely from Scandinavia, Denmark, Sweden, Finland. But if you can see this little line over here, some of them might have followed James and I from England. Yeah, and beyond Europe, oats are huge globally, and the trade of oats in 2023 totaled 2.6 billion US dollars. And these oats will stretch across far corners of the globe.
Yeah, so clearly oats have found their ways into the, oats and porridge rather, have found their ways into the mouths of divergent people through ancient and modern times. It's fed our ancestors near and far, and it's clearly a genuine backbone of some sort of global economies. So how is it and why is it that it seems to be such an undervalued grain and such an undervalued dish? Where does that Charles Dickens gruel propaganda come from? Yeah, the fact that most Brits especially, it'll be interesting to see what people think of porridge from sort of other places, but definitely Brits have this image of it from kind of bleak childhood breakfast, sort of microwave porridges that have gone horribly wrong. But I think from all of this, what we need to realise is that it's time to seize the true potential of porridge.
And we feel that while oats maybe can't single-handedly change the world and answer all its problems.
I'm not sure. I think it could happen.
Well, regardless, we think they can have some kind of role in alleviating some of the stresses in the world that we are facing today. Oats are cheap, affordable and sustainable. We feel they can contribute to a world which has a better relationship with nature through their lower carbon emissions compared to some other foods. The fact that they are cheap and nutritious means they can really help in a world that's really struggling with the cost of living at the moment. And we also feel that they can allow people to have a bit of agency over their own well-being. They're so easy to cook that people can take them into their homes and do so many interesting things with them without breaking the bank and without losing hours and hours of their lives.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the genuine reason that I think when we started Forage that we found it so exciting is that we saw porridge as something that was a canvas for so much creativity. Like you said, it gives people agency in the sense that there's not this like culinary skill cap. Anyone can kind of cook it. And I think the fact time is such a kind of hot commodity in the 21st century, you know, when kind of the demands of work, if you live in a kind of urban centre, you get this sense of increasingly depleted sense of your access to free time, and your access to kind of affordable, nutritious and delicious food is increasingly becoming a kind of privatized luxury. And I think, you know, the fact that porridge is so quick and it's so cheap and there is kind of a very limited skill cap, that it can kind of offer people, it can kind of offer those sorts of solutions to those kind of problems. It being cheap, quick to prepare and nutritious, and the fact that it can be suited to so many people's palates. You know, you can top it with really what you like. We think it's a great candidate to kind of unlock some of these global problems. And so that kind of leads us on to the next kind of concluding slides, which is the future of porridge and indeed the future of forage.
Yes, indeed. And I just want to caveat that while James was talking about the limited skill cap, that doesn't downplay our success at all.
No.
We are very talented.
Think of that.
But yes, so as James mentioned, again, we don't feel like we can necessarily change the world with one organisation, but yeah, we're not claiming to be the porridge messiahs, although we may look like it. But yeah, I think we would really love for forage, and yeah, this logo, just to mention, our friend Dan Twist designed this.
Big up Dan Twist.
Shout out to Dan. And yeah, I think we really would love for forage to become a force that can kind of take the reins offered by porridge and ride us into a spurtle-filled future. have fun translating that.
I think our dream would be really to set up a kind of forage cafe, a kind of like brick and mortar actual shop that we could where we could serve up all of our kind of forage recipes, all of our kind of OT adventures. It's what we love doing. And I think the idea of building an actual community space around feeding people porridge would be a kind of wonderfully odd privilege. And I'll make sure that when that's up and running, you'll all get kind of special offers on your first bowl of porridge. And I think that pretty much brings us to the end of our talk, and to the kind of maybe the all-important end, which is our kind of call to action, which is kind of what can you do? And the first and most important thing you can really do is follow at @forage_UK on Instagram. Fourth and final, maybe not final plug. I think that's where if you're not much of a if you're one of those people that maybe hadn't had porridge before, hadn't had porridge this week, that can give you some good easy access recipes to make something delicious.
I think also, second of all, I think we would implore you to make porridge as much as we can, because as we've tried to allude to, I think we all just need to channel the power of porridge. Porridge will do all the work for us if we allow it to. And forage would be a great place to look for some recipe ideas, but I think the important thing is that you take any kind of porridge experience that you have, or none at all, and give it a go, see if you enjoy it. And if you don't enjoy it, then try and force yourself to enjoy it by putting lots of things that you enjoy on the porridge until you can finally stomach it.
Just as any way you can get it down, do it.
Yeah, that's the most important thing.
But also you can read up, you can become oat academics, and you can see our kind of references tab at the end. I'm sure someone will be sharing the slides. And there we go, just a little sneak peek of all the different kind of articles you can read. And that can give you all of the kind of wealth of information that we've divulged. And you can tell your friends and family all about the power of porridge, because as you know, it is powerful. And now I think you can also, we're going to be cooking some porridge for you all after this, so you can kind of join us and try for yourself some kind of porridge. We're whipping up a kind of South German Black Forest cake kind of inspired porridge. So we've got some dates, we've got some cherries, we've got some cream, said dates, said cherries, chocolate.
Don't forget the kirsch.
I wouldn't forget the kirsch, although I did. Yeah, we've got some kirsch that you can serve on top as well. And I think we'd just like to say thank you so much for coming and for inviting us. We've had a lot of fun, and I hope you can go home with just a little bit of the passion for porridge that we've come to you today with.
Yes, porridge is power.
Remember that one.